Hi guys, my name is Brady and today we are using Nanlite's brand new Forza 720 daylight fixture to light this daylight interior scene. We've got a handful of shots, both wides and tights, and we're going to talk through the process that it took to get each and every shot and also some of the obstacles that we ran into when getting these shots. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this lighting segment. So on my first impression of the 720 when pulling it out of the box, it felt like a whole new light when pulling out the 720. It was durable, it was rugged, it was heavyweight, and it felt like it could really endure the day-to-day workload of on-set and production. And of course, being a very bright light fixture, what better way to battle the daylight than to do it at midday? So we've got midday light right now. We're gonna throw this up, add in some hard light, and see what we can do with this light and see how creative we can get. So when getting in on any location, the first thing that you're going to want to do is set your camera, and that's what I'm doing here. So I knew that I wanted this slow dolly push into this room here, but I wasn't sure if I wanted it coming from this direction or the other direction. But I decided to go down this long hallway because you've got a lot of layers and you want to create layers and depth and places to add pops of light throughout your frame. So I figured that coming in and pushing into this direction, you're gonna pass through this wall here and almost revealing the next room into this way. So I found that setting the dolly track to push into this new room was gonna be the best direction for me to shoot from. And now that leads me to the first light that I wanted to add in here, being a 720, and that's my key light. And typically a key light's gonna be, you've got the softbox or you've got the large source of diffusion right there on your subject. But in this case, the key light is actually gonna be hard light coming in, adding texture across the piano, across the floor, and across Elise, who is gonna be here standing as a pianist. And then a couple of the other things that we did here was to add some practicals in frame. We wanted to just add a little pop of warm tungsten light, just to add a little bit more visual interest, fill in the shadow areas a little bit more, because as you look through your frame, you're gonna want pops of bright and dark cutting across the frame. So by adding a practical here, a practical there, you're just adding in a little pops of lighting to additionally add to your hard light and texture that you're creating with the Forzas. And then I want to talk about shears for a second. A lot of the times on locations or on shoots, you'll see that there are shears in the windows, and those do a couple different things. You've got the shears that block from the outside, so now you can't really see what's out there. Say you're working in a studio or you're working in an environment that's not necessarily appealing, you can put some shears up to block that. But also what they're going to do is do a level of diffusion across the light that's outside. So say you aren't able to expose the camera down enough to expose for the outdoors, if you throw some shears in that, you're going to lose about a stop of light coming through the window, making everything just a little bit lower, a little bit more in that dynamic range of your camera. And then also additionally, you've just got another element of appeal with the shears blowing in the wind. It just adds a little bit more pizzazz, if you want to call it that. So I put shears up on all the windows that were going to be in the frame. So to add to the whole blocking out everything with the shears concept, there's actually out this window, I put a large 8x8 frame, which has currently half grid diffusion on it. And I put it just right up close to the window because out this window, there's obstruction of view, there's ugly stuff out there that we don't want to be distracting in the frame. And by adding in this diffusion, we're cutting down like 1 or 2 stops of light additionally. So it's not going to be insanely bright, leading the viewer's eye to go to the brightest part of the image, being the window. So by putting this frame outside, you're going to stop down the light, and then you got the shears on top of it just to add a little bit more diffusion. And really it's looking very nice and just glowy and ambient when it comes to this window in the frame. And then another thing that I wanted to add was this Fernie blanket right here, which is just a moving blanket. And because this room has a lot of ambient light coming in, spilling in and front filling a lot of the shadows, and I want to go for this really low-key look, meaning high contrast between bright and dark parts of your image. So I wanted the bright sunlight coming in to contrast with the shadow areas of the image. And with this blanket out of the way, you're filling in a lot of the shadows in the entire room, bringing up this ambience level, and I really didn't want that. So I just took this blanket, gaff taped that up here. So the key light that I mentioned before, it's outside, it's the Nanlite Forza 720, and on that I have their fresnel attachment as well, because the fresnel is really gonna focus in that light and make it more directional as is the sun would be. So I've got that really raking across the piano, so you start to see textures on the keys, and motivating for a tight shot that I had earlier where I know I'm gonna get texture of the light through the strings and everything inside this beautiful piano. So that's gonna be the first light, and it took a little while to dial in the exact direction because I knew that I wanted texture on the piano. I didn't want it to be blocked by coming from a too low angle, but I also knew that I needed light to splash on Elise when she's playing piano as well. I didn't want her to be completely in the shadows. So for our second light, as we're pushing in through this framing, this natural framing of the wall, this whole wall was very much in the shadow, and I wanted to add some exposure and some interest onto this wall. So out this small little window, I've actually got another 720, which doesn't need to be a 720. It's at probably 5% right now. And through that, I've got the projector mount, the Nanlite projector mount with a gobo in there to add some texture. So that way you see, it's almost like the light's casting through a tree there, just adding a little bit more exposure, raking across this wall, a little bit more shadow. So as we're pushing in through this room, it's not just one big dark shadow area. You've actually got layers and depth and interest with your lighting. And you can actually see outside, we're getting a lot of sunlight coming in through this window and some daylight that was filling in a lot of this area, and I wanted to control my light. So additionally, on top of the projector mount coming through the window, I also took a floppy, a black floppy, just to cover up any of the light spilling in. So ultimately I was controlling the light by taking away everything with that floppy and then adding in the light that I actually want to control by adding this right here. So I want to talk about what we've got going on here with the two different light setups. First of all, it's two Forza 720s. But when we moved into the tight shot, I wanted her hands to not only have sunlight across the keys, but I also wanted her face to be illuminated as well. And with the angle of the light and the distance that we were working with, I felt that it was best to just have one of them being the projection attachment shining on the keys. So I really focused that and used the blades to shine directly on the keys, creating that hard light casting across the hands. And that had to be a little bit higher, pointing down in order to squeeze through the window. But then to shine on her face, I brought the other Forza with the fresnel attachment onto it, a little bit lower and then a little bit pointed up so it's casting on her face. That way we're kind of cheating and controlling where we want our sunlight to hit our subject, thus giving us kind of the perfect angle of sunlight. So although we do have the lights off right now, when we had Elise sitting here and the sunlight shining through the window on this mid of her going back from her hands to her face and back down, I loved the hard light that we were getting on her hands from that spotlight mount, but the fresnel that was shining in and casting on her face, it was a very, very dramatic hard light. And I don't necessarily like to add a hard light to faces. So what I did was actually, we had limited time, limited hands. We were working a really tight time budget. So instead to soften this light, instead of setting up a large frame of diffusion or anything like that, I just had Nami, our assistant for the day, hold up the half grid diffusion that I had. I had a 4-foot half grid rag and I just had him hold that and feather that line where that diffusion fell right around Elise's neck or shoulder line. So that way the light that was coming onto her face was very nice and soft and just diffused a little bit to make it a little bit more pleasing, but we are still getting that hard light quality across the piano and everything else, creating great shadows. And a lot of people often refer to this technique as called the soft hob technique, which is really just dialing in your slash of light to create some diffusion where you want diffusion, but also keeping this hard light quality where you want it. So one of the solutions you might have to run into when adjusting your lighting and adjusting your shots is that, well, first of all, the light's not always exactly where you want it. So, of course, we would love for this consistency to keep the sun coming through and shining on all of the details of the piano, but we couldn't really have that luxury. So what we did is brought the same 720 inside with the projection attachment, and we brought that really, how you can see, this close to the piano, and I just feathered it like a little bit back and forth to see, you know, where the details and the shadows cross through the strings and through the mallets and all of the beautiful details that are inside the piano. So what we did was just bring this in, and then additionally, I used the blades of the attachment of the spotlight to just shape exactly where I wanted this really narrow slash of light. Originally, I just had it full blown wide open and it looked cool and you had a lot of cool bright shadows and exposure, but then we were just panning it back and forth, and that's one thing that I'll do a lot. I'll just play around with my lights and say, well, what looks good? I'll move it left and right, you know, look at the monitor, see if it looks great. And I noticed that right when you feathered the edge of that exposure, we saw this really like cool shadow area and one small highlight area, which led me to use the blades to my advantage and shape the light, leaving us just almost one slash of light. Like the sunlight was coming through the window and crossing through all the lines and edges and all the really elements of the piano, just creating this one narrow slash through the strings. And that's what I decided to do. So that's why the projection attachment was great. I did have the 720 toned down. I brought the exposure down a little bit because we're not shining outside through the window. We're right here ultimately, so I think I brought it down to about 40% or so. So that was the only light when going into the detail shots that we used, because we really didn't have a lot of environmental light to either block out or add in. And I wanted to keep, again, this very low-key contrast, high shadow look, which is why we went with just this slash of light and no other additional. So let's talk over a few of the obstacles real quick. One of the main ones and the most common obstacles that we're gonna run into is sunlight. And I knew start of the day, we're gonna have issues with it because the sun comes across the house shining in the side windows, eventually coming in these front windows actually. So I knew that not only did we have to battle the sun and as far as being there, we had to battle the sun as far as time, because once that sun crossed over to this side of the house, it was gonna shine into the door or into the windows, into the house, and really fight off the fake sun that we had added with the 720. So going into a location, using an app like Sunseeker and just shining it around the room, into the windows, finding out where the sun is going to be at certain points is crucial, especially when it comes to the Scout. So the solution to the obstacle of the sun was that we put the large 8x8 frame right outside the window to just soften up any ambience that was out there or any obstacles that were out there, and also just cut down some of the light as well. And additionally, using stuff like flags, moving blankets, floppies in windows just to cut out sun and control the light throughout the entire house, especially if you're going for a low-key look. You want to cut out any of this ambient spill throughout the scene. So I want to thank you guys for sticking around through the duration of this video. We talked a lot about the obstacles as well as the process that we took to get each and every individual shot, both the wides and the tights. And I had a blast working with the Forza 720, especially with the projection attachment on top of it, which you can really use to shape and dial it in your lighting exactly where you want, like we did with the keys and the piano and the details. And additionally, if you would like to see further lighting breakdowns and tutorials, you can find me on my channel as well, where I have a large abundance of all of that. You can find it at Brady Bessette on both YouTube and Instagram. I'll have that on screen here. But other than that, thank you again for all sticking around, and I will see you next time.